The lesions in the optic pathway. Where in the optic pathway a lesion produces ipsilateral nasal hemianopia. So in case of the right side, right optic nerve and optic chiasma where the fiber doesn't decussating fiber, a tumor or a lesion over here that involves these fibers of the right hemiretina, temporal hemiretina that has nasal visual fibers. A lesion that will cause right or ipsilateral nasal hemianopia.
Complete transaction of optic nerve before the optic chiasma will cause complete blindness in the ipsilateral eye. So a complete transaction of the right optic nerve will cause complete blindness in the right eye.
How about the optic chiasma lesion? The optic chiasma lesion produces bitemporal hemianopia because the nasal hemiretinal fiber represents the temporal visual field. A lesion causes bitemporal hemianopia or heteronymous hemianopia. And when do you have this lesion? Tumor in the pituitary gland, pituitary adenoma, presses on the optic chiasma. So what are the structure above and below the optic chiasma? Above is hypothalamus and below is pituitary gland in the sella turcica. How about the lesion in the optic tract? Optic tract has temporal fibers from contralateral side and nasal fibers from the ipsilateral side. So it has half the visual field of both eyes. In case of a right optic tract, it has the fibers from left visual fields of both eyes. That is right nasal, which is represented by right temporal hemiretinal fibers, that represents the right nasal fibers, and the left nasal hemiretinal fibers, that represents the left temporal visual field, and that leads to homonymous hemianopia, lesion on the same side of the eyes. That is, lesion in the right optic tract will cause blindness in the left side of both eyes. So any lesion beyond the optic chiasma from optic tract, because all this from here contains half the visual fibers of both eyes. So in case of the right side, lesion beyond optic chiasma from optic tract to the occipital lobe visual center will affect the left side of both eyes with a few exceptions. We'll discuss that later. Where the fiber go from optic tract? Fiber from optic tract go to the lateral geniculate nucleus. And what's lateral geniculate nucleus? It's a part of the thalamus. The lateral geniculate nucleus or lateral geniculate body has fibers from the nasal half of one retina and the temporal half of the other retina. The lateral geniculate body is 6-layered with two types of cells, a small, the parvocellular, and the large cells, the magnocellular. It also has a cells depending on the activity. The X cells are concerned with slow, sustained conduction and project onto both parvo and magnocellular laminae. The Y cells conduct fast and project on magnocellular laminae only. The X and Y cells are also present in the ganglion cells. The layer 1, 4, and 6 of the lateral geniculate body receive inputs from contralateral eye, and the layers 2, 3, and 5 receive input from the ipsilateral eye. What's optic radiation? These are the fibers that emerge from the lateral geniculate body, also known as geniculocalcarine tract, and they have two sets of fibers, superior group and an inferior group. They have a different route. So a lesion in superior produces a different lesion and an inferior produces a different lesion, and it may involve the whole thickness, then it produces homonymous hemianopia. The fibers from the upper quadrant of the retina bring the visual fibers from lower quadrant of retina and end in the medial half of the lateral geniculate body, and they terminate on the superior lip of the calcarine fissure. So the upper retinal quadrant fibers bring the lower visual field fibers, they go to the medial part of the lateral geniculate body and end up in the superior lip of the calcarine fissure in the visual cortex, whereas the fibers from the lower quadrant of the retina end in the lateral half of the lateral geniculate body and terminate in the inferior lip of the calcarine fissure in the visual cortex. So the lower retinal quadrant fiber, they bring the upper visual field fiber and end up in the inferior lip of the calcarine fissure. The upper retinal fiber, they loop around the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle and then they pass into the visual cortex, where the lower ones, they pass through the parietal lobe and through the internal capsule to go to the visual cortex. The Meyer loop brings the inferior retinal fiber, they loop around the lateral ventricle, and the Barham's loop that pass through the internal capsule, which brings the superior retinal fiber. What's pie in the sky and the flow in the sky? These are the lesions in the optic radiations. The Meyer's loop, which has the upper lower retinal quadrant fibers, a lesion in that produces quadrantic hemianopia. This is known as the pie in the sky. Whereas a lesion in the Brahmas loop, which brings the lower quadrant retinal fibers, produces a lower quadrant retinal blindness. This is known as pie in the floor. The visual cortex. The area 17 or the striate cortex is the primary visual cortex. Area 18 and 19 are the visual association area. Lesion of the visual cortex cause homonymous hemianopia, which is sparing of the macular area. Representation in the visual cortex is along the calcarine fissure, and the foveal or macular region is represented posteriorly. Visual cortex has 6 layers. Axons from the lateral geniculate body end on the pyramidal cells on Brodmann area 4 of the cortex, and they project on the other layers of the visual cortex. How are the cells arranged in visual cortex? Like somatosensory cortex, the cells in the visual cortex are arranged in orientation column, which gives exact location of the object. How the cells in the pyramidal layer function? Cells in the pyramidal layer 4 of the visual cortex, they have an on-center and off-center cells. They respond to a bar of light covering the center. These cells are connected to the simple cells, which are present in the layer 3, and these simple cells are connected to the complex cells, which are present in the layer 2, 3, 5 and 6. Simple cell responds to bar of light, lines or edges. Firing rate of the simple cell decreases if the bar of the light moves more than 10 degrees, whereas the complex cells, they respond to a linear stimulus. The macular fibers from lateral geniculate body end up more posteriorly on the lips of the calcarine fissure. The macular presentation area is very large and separate from the peripheral. Which arterial occlusion produces homonymous hemianopia? Blood supply of the occipital cortex is by the posterior cerebral arteries and the branches of the middle cerebral artery. Occlusion of the posterior cerebral artery produces homonymous hemianopia with sparing of the macular area. Why there is a sparing of the macular area? Because macular area is more posteriorly at the tip, and that part is supplied by the branches of the middle cerebral artery. So occlusion of the middle cerebral artery produces homonymous macular defects. Can destruction of the occipital lobe produce complete blindness? Unilateral destruction of the occipital lobe does not produce complete blindness. It produces homonymous hemianopia. Only bilateral occipital lobe destruction produces complete blindness. How do you differentiate a blind eye from a lesion in the optic nerve or an occipital lobe? So the occipital lobe destruction, bilateral blind eyes, whereas in an optic nerve, if destroyed, it involves only one eye, and the light reflex is absent if blindness is due to optic nerve involvement before the optic chiasma. But if the destruction is in the occipital lobes bilaterally, then the pupillary light reflex will be present in that case.